Hey everyone, thank you for joining me today for our episode of Caserta's Data Intelligence webinar series. We're broadcasting live from the Caserta headquarters in New York City, and I'm your host, Remy Rosenbaum. Today, we're going to explore the topic of data silos. Well, more specifically, how to eliminate data silos across an enterprise in order to drive growth and unlock cost savings opportunities. So, what is a data silo? Well, we consider a data silo when only one group or even one person in an organization can access a set or source of data. So think about it like instead of all parts of an organization being able to leverage your enterprise data for growth and efficiency, data silos instead tend to hamper business goals. They increase your costs and they cause delays. Several factors may lead to data silos, such as technological, structural, cultural, or even a mixture of those. Yesterday I got back from a great data-driven healthcare conference down in Texas where I gave a keynote. You can feel free to check it out on my LinkedIn where I posted it. And I touched on data silos in my presentation. So afterwards, when I'm chatting with the delegates at the conference, it really became apparent that data silos were a pervasive problem in many of their organizations, which was hindering their ability to reach their business goals. They just didn't have the right data. And interestingly enough, although nearly everyone I talked to admitted to this problem, only very few were actively tackling it. Many said it was too tricky a problem to solve and that there was no clear owner of the problem or of the data. So for today, we have an excellent presenter who will dive into the world of data silos, Anand Asthana, who is a senior cloud architect at Caserta. Anand has been in the big data space since the early days of Hadoop and has extensive experience with large systems both on-prem and in the cloud. He has led multiple data ecosystem migrations, both to AWS and GCP, and he spreads the gospel of decimating data silos. A bit of housekeeping, and then we'll get started. Caserta's complimentary data expert webinar series that I host is designed to give you insight into today's hottest technological trends and issues. I produce these webinars in order to educate you on what's going on in the world and how we can use data to solve our business problems. After this webinar, I really do encourage you to ask me any questions on how to apply what you've learned today at your organization. With Caserta, our initial consultations are always free, and if we find an opportunity to work together, then of course we can discuss the next steps. But if not, we will gladly point you in the right direction. We want to help you. After today's webinar, I will send you a recording to the email address you provided. And if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please enter them in the questions panel on the right, and we'll answer them during the live Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Okay, Anant, the stage is all yours.
All right. Hey, everyone. I'm Anant, and I will be talking about eliminating data silos. So first things first, let's talk about the power of data in today's day. So as all of you might have experienced, seen, and witnessed how data-driven companies and just data-driven processes in general have transformed everything as we know it. So like you would see big changes in advertising and targeting or in healthcare. And making the right decisions depends on having the right data to make that decision. And having the right data has led to a lot of innovation and better decision making, better targeting, better results all across the organization, across healthcare, across several verticals. So we're going to get into what a data silo is and how this hinders us from reaching that data-driven goal in a lot of ways. As Remy pointed out, a data silo is a collection of data that is only available to one department, one business unit, one set of people in an organization. So one of my experiences, this is something that I was involved in about 8 years ago, and it was very personal once we realized what was going on. I worked for a company that made health and human services software, which was being used for case management for a lot of homeless shelters and the like. So you have people that are providing them help with the mental health issues. There's people who are taking care of them on a medical front. There's other programs such as teaching programs trying to reskill them for jobs that are going on, and other social work issues, people who know their backgrounds. But these were all done in distinct groups and distinct departments. And this was causing a huge hindrance in the care of these people, because let's say if someone comes in and he has an underlying mental health issue that, because of HIPAA regulations and whatnot, wasn't accurately being conveyed to their case manager, or the other way where it's like, hey, he went through something very traumatic that hasn't appeared in your mental health profile. So this was a huge hindrance in taking care of these people. And through the course of a year or so, once the organization started sharing data, there was a distinctly noted improvement in the care that could be provided through this organization. And we're going to touch upon different causes of why data silos exist, why they're so common, and how to eliminate them. So why do data silos exist? There's a human element to this, and there's a technological element to this. So for human element, let's talk about things like culture. Is the company culture based on being open? Is it based on sharing? Is it based on information in general, not just data being shared, or is it a culture of secrecy or privacy? So that is a huge hindrance. Another major factor is growth, where departments grow and companies get more staff, more people, and more departments. There hasn't been an establishment of protocol, an establishment of how to communicate, how data is going to be shared, how company-wide information is going to be shared, and all of these tie in very closely. Another major reason for data silos is, let's say we're talking to doctors who are part of the same organization. The doctors are using ERP system that does not talk to your case management system, so the data is locked in these systems or softwares that don't necessarily integrate with each other, and integrating them becomes this process of sharing printouts over files, or diverse ways of which people try to slightly get around it as best as they can, but it is still very tricky and very limited. Another a major factor which this whole thing ties into, since we're talking from a healthcare perspective or healthcare experience, is compliance. There's HIPAA regulations, there is security regulations, there's privacy regulation, there's California Privacy Act, the GDPR. All these regulations make it harder to share data. With that said, there is ways to get around all of these issues. So for example, with the HIPAA information, it's health information privacy prevention. So I cannot share your test results with someone if I'm sharing it with your name, but your test results, once they've been anonymized, can be shared. So if you can anonymously combine a person's outcomes with their results, even if you don't know who that exact person is, you can start drawing conclusions of, if such an event happens, it impacts their health in a certain way, or if a healthcare breakthrough or improvement helps the person, that impacts their life in a certain way. So we can start deriving meaning while still protecting privacy and maintaining legality, being compliant. So in a more corporate scenario, data silos are very common. Big reason we've noticed through several different enterprise organizations is different departments have different goals, different priorities, so they do not collaborate on meeting combined goals or overall company goals, or sometimes they're not even communicating correctly organization-wide. There's also times where there isn't a good enough incentive for people to synergize on these goals. So there's times where people are either trying to get to department goals or personal goals, where data is leveraged as a source of power or advantage. So once the correct motivation, the correct drive is given to the people, and also if they are shown the advantages of eliminating these data silos and working synergistically, it becomes more apparent why we need to team up to share data, and how eliminating these data silos and coming up with a unified data platform helps the organization perform better and reach bigger goals. So This is one of the Wall Street Journal articles that I read about a year ago. It was talking about big data sprawl through companies, which talks about how with different employees having different tasks, they use different software. And since they use different software, they get data from somewhere, a source, and it goes into the software, gets processed. Other data is joined, collaborated. We're talking, pre-Salesforce sort of tools that have, let's say, sales data. It goes in. You have a bunch of client data that goes in, but there's not an ability to share it through, let's say, going down the chain or through other wings of the company. So there are several examples or situations where you have different people using different tools and it doesn't get across. This is a finding from IBC, was that employees spend 35% of their work time finding data. And this is one of those things that really speaks to how expensive finding data can get, because if you have a large workforce that is really just scrambling, finding data for a large portion of their jobs, instead of actually taking action, drawing meaning, and moving forward, drawing conclusions, making useful decisions with the data, people spend a lot of time just acquiring this data, which ends up being a pretty big hindrance. So since we've talked about, laid the groundwork for this, impact of data silos is, inefficiency, lack of productivity in a lot of scenarios. We've noticed people spending significant amount of time either looking for data, and I'm talking looking for data through several databases, several warehouses, or physically or humanly looking for data, as in walking up to the next department and saying, hey, do you know about this? Can you share this data with us? So that brings in a huge, inefficiency to the organization with time, so much time spending looking for this data. Another downside of data silos is inconsistency or lack of data integrity. So let's say a metric is being collected through different sources. These metrics might not speak the same number. And this leads to inconsistency. So once you pull in your data, you'll realize that, let's say we're getting income information on one of these healthcare patients, which says how much did someone make, and you're getting one from what the government's giving you, one from the person, one from another previous organization they were staying with or being taken care of. You'll realize these numbers don't match and they differ largely in a lot of cases. So this difference or inconsistency can impede progress. It can lead to inconsistent conclusions or wrong conclusions. And again, duplicate data where you have multiple copies that don't match, it creates a lot of confusion. And it inhibits creating a complete view of entities. In our case, we're talking about, actual people who are really going through hard times, and there's people trying to take care of them. We don't have complete view of what is going on with these people and how to best help them. Where once you have a complete picture of as much as you know about this person, it really becomes much easier to provide them the right care, the right help. So now that we're going to get into, since we've talked about we really should share data, what are the advantages of sharing data, we come to the question of understanding what is to be shared. And let us, for just the scope of this slide or this conversation right here, assume we're free to share any kind of data with anyone in the organization, even though that is not true. We'll get to that in just a second. So let us say your organization have multiple departments, you want to share data. Not all data is meaningful to be shared with everyone. A lot of data really is not even worth it for the department that is gathering it, or there's a lot of bad data, noise data that comes in. So before we share data, there needs to be an understanding of what needs to be shared, what purposes can it be served, and communicating what the data set being shared is, what meaning it carries, what columns, and how to interpret them. Because if you're the department sharing a set of data, you absolutely know that your department has the most expertise on that piece of data. And even though it might be helpful to someone, if you're the department that is sharing this data, you probably have a better understanding than the next person who's going to look at it. So this brings up important cultural shifts and technology shifts that need to happen to share not only the data, but the meaning that the data carries. So communicating through documentation, through data catalogs, maybe even having internal company meets or other ways to share knowledge within the company to express what the data being shared is, what meaning it carries, and how it can be interpreted so that there's not misinterpretations and whatnot. So once we figure out what data needs to be shared, now we have an idea of, hey, we would like to share this data and we would like to move on with sharing this data. We start talking about some of the technological challenges and technology-based solutions that can help and aid your organization in doing that. So data governance is something that becomes very important. We're going to get into this deeper as we go through this presentation. But data governance talks about how is data to be shared, what data can be shared, compliance, also ensuring quality of the data that is being shared. And this all makes this data that is being shared meaningful to people who are utilizing this data. And this all leads to the conversation of a unified data ecosystem. And in today's day, with the vast amount of technology solutions available, this can be done on-premise, it can be done with the aid of the cloud, and it can be done through several different tools that can make this data approachable or visible to people of different skill sets. So if you are good with SQL, you might be able to access data in a different way than someone who really just wants to put together charts or understand data in a certain way. Like higher level executives who may or may not know how to write SQL, but they still have insight into the business processes and they can gain a lot of meaning from this data. In our view, dealing with the human elements is typically, or in our experience, human elements typically the bigger challenge. Technology is really just a matter of finding the right solution, sticking with us, finding the right vendors, getting the right guidance, getting the right assistance. The cultural changes are something that the company has to evolve into and really grow into internally. So since we're talking about how technology can help you, there's several technology platform choices that can help you with eliminating these data silos, especially once we talk about cloud technology. If we're talking, let's say, Google Cloud or Amazon Cloud, this really takes off the responsibility and the work of managing infrastructure and what goes on under the hood. And we can just gather data from multiple different sources and make it very easily shareable within the organization. It makes it easier to create a unified data warehouse at a higher level that has company-wide data that has been shared through different departments. And now we're getting into not necessarily cloud technology that can be done in cloud. We're talking about data pipelines. So data pipelines would be pipelines that take data from your department, maybe clean it up, maybe do some transformations, and then upload this data into your data warehouse where it gets shared, and data lakes where this data ends up in a more raw form. This raw data really isn't meaningful to a wider audience. It is meaningful to only people who know about this data. Since they know about this data needs to get transformed, cleaned up, or maybe some information needs to get added to it to make this data meaningful to a wider audience. So a company might have multiple data lakes that harmonize into a data warehouse that can be shared organization-wide. since we were talking about some of the security and privacy requirements, there's a lot of tooling that goes into anonymizing data, or maybe encrypting or hashing fields of private information, such as names, phone numbers, emails, addresses, and whatnot. And once we go through that, we need to also address identity and authentication management, which is a huge factor in a unified data platform. Certain people in your organization might be allowed to only access certain sets of data. You might have contractors that get very limited data, get only what they need. There might be employees that only need to be shared data with is very, very relevant to their job versus employees such as data scientists or C-level employees, executives that have the ability to draw meaning from the complete data set. And they do need access to all this data. So having a system in place that can manage identity, authentication, and then based on that, regulate what data gets shared with what person is a key piece to sharing data while maintaining security and privacy protection on top of that data. So the value that a unified data platform like this brings in is it unifies these disconnected business processes. So since I was talking about human services, understanding what is going on in a person's medical health versus mental health versus what is happening in their education, and tying that all together really help provide better care to these individuals. And the results are very visible, just not only the numbers, but also, physically or humanly, with how quickly these people are getting on their own feet, getting jobs and whatnot. So in a business sense, this really helps unifying business processes. It can help you streamline processes that are happening, streamline decision-making, help you automate certain processes. This also allows an organization to view their data as a very valuable asset and monetizing it. One of our clients we were dealing with does what is called fuel recovery, where they gather data from trucking companies based on how much fuel they're consuming on what routes, and where they're filling their fuel and how the truck was moved. And since they had information from the beginning to the end on the whole process, they could provide the companies carrying the loads information on how to optimize their trucking routes and where to fill up to optimize on fuel costs, and then also providing benefits to the shippers with reduced fuel costs. So this is, win-win. And the company doing this, their biggest asset was their data on trucking routes and fueling sources. So once we harmonize and get all the data into a unified data platform, the organization can do or be able to treat a lot of this data as assets, since it is meaningful information, instead of Billy sold the fuel at this pump out in the middle of nowhere, Minnesota, which really means nothing to no one unless it ties into the whole picture. And this, again, since we were talking about maximizing business value, minimizing costs, which is the example that we were just talking about. So here's some statements from a practical software architecture book that I was reading a few months ago. 63% of the organization realized a positive return on analytic investments within the first year, which speaks to how quickly unifying your data can provide benefits. It doesn't take several years, such as other infrastructure improvements do. And 69% of analytical-driven organizations create a significant positive impact on business. So as you can see, the business impact, business benefit of unifying our data is very valuable, but we also need to, obviously, while doing this, be cognizant of all the security and the compliance factors in there. So since we are talking about security, we're going to talk about data governance, get a little bit deeper into this point, because data governance is the process where it deals with a cultural, a personal element and also a technological element, and this is kind of where the crossover typically happens. So within an organization, different departments, different business units have data that they would like to share. There needs to be rules on data quality, what kind of data can be shared, what kind of data is not even worth sharing, what data is considered bad data if it doesn't even have the right fields and whatnot. So data governance, takes care of the picture overall, top to bottom, on what is to be shared, how to share it, and how to make it secure. So once you're talking data quality, it really ties down to what data is worth sharing, adopting a process of data quality. So this would tie into, let's say, a published document that goes through the organization saying, hey, this is what you should and shouldn't share, and also tools that validate the quality and the validity of the data before it is shared. And as you might know, bad data can lead to bad decisions. So we do need to make sure data that is getting shared with people, getting shared with decision makers is of good quality. Going up the chain, we're going to talk about a master data management. This is management of, what all data do you have, where is it stored, how is it stored, and how can it be utilized. And there's several tools that provide capabilities to manage master data management. But this is talk for later down this presentation. We'll get to that in a second. Data cataloging. Data catalog is a catalog, and I'm sure people are familiar with data catalogs in different ways, different sources. The government data source, I can't remember the name, it has a very good data catalog where you can go view all these data sets. It has a description of what the data set is and a description of the meaning of all the columns. So having a data, that makes this data usable to a person who really knows nothing about the process. So if you go to data.gov, you'll see a beautiful example of what a good data catalog is and how it really makes it convenient to use data. So within an organization, having, say, a sales department, a marketing department, and a quality control sharing this data would need a lot of information from the department so that other departments, other people understand what this data means. And this is, the technology, and this is a small portion. The technology is what we would consider the easy element. It is a cultural shift. It is a human investment with people investing in time to make sure that this data is shared, it is cataloged, it is understandable to other people. And this becomes your primary means of communicating via data within the organization and sometimes even externally. Since we are talking about data governance, one of the underlying factors is making sure processes are repeatable. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with ETL processes, and you have data that comes in from a source, goes through some sort of ETL process, and then it ends up in a data lake or a data warehouse or a database somewhere. But the process to gather this data, process it, clean it, needs to be repeatable and not a one-off, a whimsical process, because this is what makes the data usable every time you get it, instead of being one-offs, or because one-off data really can't be used by anyone. It just disappears, gets hidden, and never gets utilized, and never unlocks the full potential of the meaning that piece of data could have uncovered. So now that we've talked about all these underlying elements, this all ties into a very neatly drawn out process for data that needs to be followed throughout the organization, listing how data comes in, how is it processed, how do we ensure it meets quality requirements, how can it be shared, who can it be shared, understanding privacy requirements, understanding security requirements within your organizations, and making sure the data is shared with the right people. So this all boils down to having a well drawn out process through the company of how to handle data, process it, share it. And again, going back to security, can't emphasize about security and privacy enough, especially since GDPR has been such an important thing in the last few months, the last few years. So with data governance, we can make sure we know who access what data sources are available to what people, what information has been derived and how other people can view this. Another important factor of, once you do unify data, break down these silos, people are going to perform experiments, people are going to perform different reporting, meaning is going to be drawn from this data, which is secondary data or information. This information also needs to get shared and not, again, get locked in, your favorite BI tool or your data scientist's laptops or notebooks or something of that sort. So data not only is siloed at the bottom level of the raw data, but also the information that is derived from it needs to be shared to the organization. So this is the Caserta data pyramid. This is how our organization approaches unifying data and dealing with data from the bottom up, from when you get raw data, and to build it into a data warehouse that is shareable across the organization. So at the bottom, if you see, we get raw data. So this could be, input from sensors. This could be data coming in from various forms through the sites or banking information or whatnot. We collect the data. We have processes that quality check this data. We catalog all the data that is received, and then it is processed into a data lake. And here we organize the data into, meaningful sets of data, meaningful lakes, and attach things that are relevant or go with each other. And as we move up, we come to the data science workspace where we provide them data that has been pre-joined. So let's say sales data versus marketing data. How is sales leading or marketing leading sales? So data sets like these are joined in and provided in a convenient way for data scientists, machine learning engineers who have a deeper understanding and also deeper capability of operating on this data through tools and whatnot. And then comes the top level, which is the most governed, most trusted set of data, which has been thoroughly cleaned. All the organization rules and privacy protection and everything has been applied to this data. You end up in your big data warehouse, which is a unified source of the data that is being shared through the organization. This would be the source for business intelligence, ad hoc queries, reporting, and all other business decision processes that would go in. So this lays sort of the groundwork or a basic understanding of why or what data silos are and how we can work towards eliminating them. This conversation is not necessarily in the scope of this presentation, but if there's questions, you can go into this. We're going to talk about how individual organizations, there's several tools that don't talk to each other. There's several formats of data and how we can gather all of it and design a process around it to make sure that this data gets shared. Caserta has done several engagements of creating unified data platforms. Caserta Data Pyramid is sort of the process that we follow, and it has had a wide range of success through several different verticals. With all of this, we conclude our presentation. We're going to have some time for questions now.
Is silo busting primarily about technology?
Silo busting is primarily, in our experience, about people, about culture, about a cultural shift in the organization. These data silos, the technology to solve these or the technology to eliminate them is fairly approachable and not that tricky. It is really the person element of encouraging people to share, providing the right incentives for departments to share their data, and also providing education on how we can utilize this data that has been gathered to come up with something meaningful and target larger company goals instead of departmental goals. So it is not only just a technology problem, it is much more of a cultural problem.
Okay, thank you. So question, you spoke about data catalogs. Is there one data catalog that you would recommend and why?
So I wouldn't say outright recommend one data catalog. They serve They have very different sets of features, diverse sets of tools and user friendliness they provide. Again, coming from an open source background, coming from an open source as an open source contributor, I really like open source tools. So my personal preference is for a tool called CCAN. It's an open source data catalog. It has hundreds, if not thousands, of plugins that can tailor that tool to work for you. Again, this is personal preference. And mostly because it is an open source tool, I really like this tool. It is not necessarily the most user friendly. So, there's other tools like Alteryx or Elation that are much more user friendly, much more approachable from an enterprise organization if you don't have the right resources to develop a tool like CCAN.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think maybe an Elation or a Calibra or an Alteryx would be a better place for most people to start. Which brings us into our next question. What's the best way to start with quick wins if you're going to start eliminating data silos?
Quick wins. So quick wins is, between your departments, if you can come to an understanding of, hey, this is data that would be meaningful to share, and then picking off things like, hey, this data doesn't have any very restrictive things, like this doesn't have any PII. So finding data sets that are low-hanging fruit, and then starting to put them in a data warehouse. And a data warehouse could be something as simple as BigQuery or Snowflake or Redshift, a tool that's easily approachable. It's easy to load data into. There's multiple tools that allow you to get data in and out of them. So this really lowers the barrier to entry once you understand what data can be shared without running into compliance and privacy restrictions. And once you get the data into these tools, also sharing, hey, this data does exist here, either verbally through meetings or also with good documentation. If you use a tool like BigQuery, it gives you a little bit of cataloging capabilities where you can write data on every column, explain what the column does. You can write a little note about the data set. So using a tool like BigQuery or Snowflake is a really quick win. They're already there. You don't have to manage infrastructure. It's very easy to get data into it and share data sets where people can read through and understand what your data sets are.
Excellent, thank you. Which actually brings us to our next question that someone asked. You mentioned that people have data on their desktop computers. There's also data from Shadow IT. What is one method which you could recommend for data discovery, which would allow you to locate and catalog all of your data?
That actually is a big challenge because people get data. There's times where people get data through emails. We've all seen this happen where people receive meaningful data sets through their email. They're downloaded onto personal desktops and laptops. So this is, again, one of those not so much of a technological challenge as it is a cultural or a human challenge. And it's all about encouraging people, first of all, providing a place for people to share this data, which could be, an AWS bucket or a Google Cloud bucket or a location within your organization where this data can be uploaded. And some sort of a cataloging mechanism. Again, I'm not suggesting Excel, but if you are in the absolute beginning of doing this, that might be the basic bare minimal tool you can start with. Like, hey, here's a spreadsheet of what data sits where and what it means. And that's taking small steps and then working into unifying the whole data process from there. Okay. And like we said, this. Oh, sorry.
No, go on.
This really is more of a human process or a cultural process than a technology process. Go ahead, Ravi.
Oh, and we have time for one more question. Somebody asked, how would Caserta come in and help with the silo busting? Do you want to take that one, or you want me to take it away?
I'll let you take that one, and I can add to it.
Sure. So the process for whomever asked is usually we'll come in and we'll try to realize what you're trying to achieve, which in this case would be to share data across the enterprise. So we would try and interview the necessary stakeholders within your organization. We would come on-prem or we would conduct interviews. to see where this data is. We would get a better understanding of the culture, of the processes of the people, and then we would give an actionable roadmap after we're completed with our assessment of best practices to do. If it's a technological solution, perhaps we would recommend an architecture that would include a data cataloging solution like Anand mentioned, like a CCAN or a Calibra or a Alation. And also perhaps bring it into a centralized location, perhaps within the cloud or even on-prem, but in a centralized data lake with an architecture that would bring to one place. And of course, in our recommendations, like Anand said, we would encourage people to put all their data into one place or be a solid data governance practice. And also we would identify perhaps there needs to be a hierarchy change. Who's going to be the steward of the data? Who's going to own this data? Where is it going to be? And who's going to enforce the rules behind the data? So those are all questions we would answer in our engagement. Did you want to add to that, Anand?
Just a couple of things. So just to add to what Remy is saying, providing the right incentives so we could help the decision makers in the company provide or help the decision makers come up with incentives to be given to departments or teams or organizations within the company to share this data. And once you start seeing small wins from sharing your data, it really becomes obvious why this data should be shared.
Definitely. We're actually going to add one more question because it's a good one. What tools and or techniques would you recommend to achieve semantic interoperability?
Semantic interoperability. Can you elaborate a little bit more on exactly what you were asking or what the question is?
So to the question asker, I'm going to ask that you can elaborate more, but in the meantime, I think what you mean is different data sources and formats working together and how they could all fit into one master strategy.
Yeah, running with that assumption, that's sort of what I understood too. There's multiple ways and sort of meshing multiple ways to do it. One is having a unified or a standardized data source or data format that is shared across the company. So even if you have data coming in as JSON and CSV and your tab delimited files and whatnot, as we move from the raw data to the data lake to the data warehouse, which is the most processed data, you process these the sets of data into a unified or singular format, which might be Parquet or Oracle or whatever format of your preference. And another layer that doesn't necessarily need to work as a separate approach, it really fits in with this, is data virtualization, which once you drop data into a data virtualization tool, you have CSVs, you have Excel, you have all kinds of data, but the virtualization tool lets you interact with this data in a unified or a singular fashion. So, you could write queries on top of data that might be one coming from SQL and another one coming from a CSV file or an XML file somewhere. So a data virtualization tool can be what is presented to the final presentation layer, but it can also be a tool that works deeper down to help you convert all of the data into a singular format.